Good afternoon. Welcome to a virtual lecture brought to you by the Nanovic Institute for European Studies from the University of Notre Dame. My name is Clemens Sedmark and I'm the interim director of the Nanovic Institute. The Nanovic Institute's mission is quite simple: to bring Europe to Notre Dame and to bring Notre Dame to Europe. Today, this afternoon, we bring Europe to you in a special way. The lecture will be given by a prominent scholar and wonderful colleague with deep European connections who will talk about his important work in Europe. I have the honor of introducing Nanovic faculty fellow Paolo Carozza, professor of law, concurrent professor of political science, and director of the Kellogg Institute for International Studies here in Notre Dame. Paolo Carozza is a worldwide respected human rights scholar. He joined the Notre Dame Law School faculty in 1996 with an AB from Harvard University and a JD from Harvard Law School. At the law school here in Notre Dame, he served as Associate Dean for International and Graduate Programs and also as the director of the Clow Center for Civil and Human Rights from 2011 through 2013. Professor Carozza has also accepted major responsibilities on a national and an international level. In 2019-20, he was a member of the US State Department's independent, nonpartisan advisory commission on unalienable rights. From 2006 to 2010, Professor Carozza was a member of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the principal international body responsible for the promotion and protection of human rights in the Western Hemisphere, and served as its president in 2008 and 2009. Paolo Carozza was appointed by Pope Francis in 2016 to be a member of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences. He has been honored, which is very important in Europe, with doctorates honoris causa from the Pázmány Péter Catholic University in Hungary and from the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology. In 2019, Notre Dame awarded Professor Carozza its Reinhold Niebuhr Award for Notre Dame faculty whose body of academic work and life promote or exemplify the area of social justice in modern life. It's such a privilege to have Paolo with us this afternoon. Our esteemed speaker will talk about his work as the United States member of the European Commission for Democracy through Law, also known as the Venice Commission. The Venice Commission is the Council of Europe's expert advisory body on issues of constitutionalism, the rule of law, democracy, and fundamental rights. The Venice Commission has been actively involved in many of the most notable recent controversies regarding constitutionalism, democracy, and the rule of law in places such as Poland and Hungary, Ukraine and Armenia, Turkey, and the Balkans. This is clearly a fascinating and specific perspective on Europe. We are excited to learn about Professor Carozza's work. After the lecture, there will be the opportunity to ask questions. Please make use of the Q&A button. Dear Paolo, my friend and colleague, role model and mentor, so many thanks. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Clemens, for that much too generous and too long introduction. It's great to be here. I'm eager to share this experience with the Nanovic Institute, which has always been dear to my heart. It's the first institute at Notre Dame that made me one of its faculty fellows, and still one that I care about so deeply. So it's wonderful here to be sharing this with you. So my talk today is not intended exactly to be a scholarly talk about these issues, but one really more focused on practice, providing people who are probably mostly unfamiliar with the Venice Commission and its work an introduction to what it does. But I'll try to use that also to make at least a few reflections at the end about some of the things that I think that work reveals to us about the state of constitutionalism and democracy and the rule of law in Europe and beyond it. But mostly I hope it can be just an introduction to a great discussion afterwards. So I'll try to limit my comments to no more than 30 minutes here. So let's start first with some background on the Venice Commission. What is it? As Clemens said in his introduction, it is the Council of Europe's advisory body on constitutionalism and the rule of law, and its formal name is the European Commission for Democracy through Law. It gets its name, its common name, the Venice Commission, because of where we meet. In Venice 4 times a year. In fact, the slide behind me shows the room in the Scuola Grande San Giovanni where we meet in Venice. And I have to say that's one of the greatest sacrifices of having to serve is having to go to Venice 4 times a year and meeting in this beauty. The location is actually important, I think, in a certain way in helping to cultivate a certain ethos of the Venice Commission and its work. We're not meeting in the bureaucratic, stifling drabness of the Strasbourg buildings and windowless conference rooms, but in a place that almost unconsciously is a living reminder of the history of Europe and of the development of the rule of law and constitutionalism in the European legal tradition. So the Venice Commission begins with proposals in the Council of Europe in the late 1980s, but really only gets steam and gets endorsed leading to its establishment in 1990 after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the beginning of the dissolution of the Soviet Empire. There's an awareness at the time of a great need for the emerging democracies to design and implement constitutional and legal reforms in order to create and consolidate the transitions that they're going through. That's what the Venice Commission was intended to serve. So it does so as an independent and technical body, providing advice on constitutional matters, principally in the form of advisory opinions that are issued at the request of states or international institutions. And I'll say more about that. And on matters relating to democratic institutions, elections, referenda, the regulation of political parties, the protection of fundamental rights, frequently on the administration of justice, both by ordinary courts and constitutional courts, and then any other matters of constitutional law generally. It's been referred to by some of its observers and commentators as a body that engages in comparative constitutional engineering, which is a provocative phrase, I think, that we might have time to return to at the end. So on the basis of what does it give those advisory opinions? Well, as the title says, it's intended to be a commission on democracy through law. And so it has to rely in the first instance on those provisions of formal binding law that are available, international treaties, in particular of the Council of Europe and others that are applicable to any of the member states in question where we're working. But obviously, a great deal of what is important in the sphere of democratic consolidation and the rule of law is not codified in a formal way in treaties. It is applicable at all in the form of comparative analysis of best practices, the experience of other constitutional systems, the soft and recommended standards that arise out of advisory bodies like our own, but other ones, and the need to make particular judgments in context. So the question of how it operates through law is another one that I would like to return to at the end as one of the strengths and also one of the challenges of the Commission. So it's composed of the member states of the Council of Europe. That's 47 states stretching through all of Western Europe and essentially all of geographic Europe except for Belarus at this point. But it is also open to other states as well. Unusually for a regional body, it changed its statute to allow states beyond Europe to become associated with it, become full members of it. And so beyond the 47, there are another 15 at the moment, including the United States, for 62 total. And the individual members, like myself and like the others you see in the background behind me, are appointed by our respective states, but we serve in our individual capacity, which is very important. So we serve as independent experts, and we are not, we don't respond to, in fact, we are affirmatively prohibited from taking instructions in any way from the states of our origin, or indeed any other states. And most of the members of the Commission are pretty distinguished, experienced senior professors of public law or members of apex courts, Supreme Courts, constitutional courts, sometimes members of parliamentary committees or ombudspersons for human rights, and so forth. it's a really a pretty extraordinary group of people gathered collectively each time we meet, in terms of the depth and breadth of the experience that they bring and the seriousness of purpose that they bring to what they do. It's one of the best parts of being there from my perspective. So in terms of how the Venice Commission goes about its work, typically we receive a request for an opinion. The Venice Commission does not act sua sponte on its own initiative, but rather receives requests either from the institutions of the Council of Europe, the Secretary General, the Parliamentary Assembly, or so forth, or from the member states themselves. And by member states themselves, that means any of the constitutionally recognized bodies within the member state. So again, unusually to some extent for an international organization, it does not rely only on the univocal representation of the head of state for the state, but instead, the president or the speaker of the parliament or the ombudsman or the constitutional court can all request opinions, which makes for important political dynamics in terms of the effect of the opinions and how they insert themselves into the domestic political and constitutional structures. So, for example, opposition parties may request an opinion when they're unhappy with what a majority is trying to do in terms of a constitutional or legal reform. Opinions can also be requested by member states regarding other member states, and that did happen early on in the life of the Commission a little bit, but happens rarely now. The subject of the request can be anything to do with constitutions, constitutional law, referenda, political parties, and so forth. However, it's important to note that, unlike a court, the Venice Commission is not an adjudicative body. And so it's not engaged in fact-finding. It's not determining violations the way the European Court of Human Rights would, for example, but rather engages in an analysis of the law. And the scope of the opinion is determined by the questions that are submitted to it, not going beyond it. The way that we prepare those opinions involves, as you, if you had sort of done the mental math as I was talking about the membership and so forth, you'll realize, over 60 members of the Venice Commission, obviously not everybody is preparing opinions simultaneously. So when a request comes in, a small subset, 3 to 5 typically, of the members of the Commission are selected and appointed as rapporteurs to work on the opinion. So in my case, for example, in the last year and a half, I've had the responsibility of being involved in drafting on behalf of the Commission opinions on Bosnia and Herzegovina, 1 on Poland, 1 on Kyrgyzstan, 2 on Turkey, and 2 on Ukraine. And the same would be true of most of my colleagues, very distributed both geographically and so forth. And we work with the help of a very experienced professional staff of the Secretariat in Strasbourg. In order to prepare those opinions, typically we would meet with governmental officials, civil society organizations, sometimes members of the international community present in a particular country or involved in it. They would, in non-COVID times, it would involve in-country meetings always, where one gets much more of a feel for the reality that we're immersed in. But recently, of course, all of that has been done virtually. And then on the basis of a study of the background documents and laws, a study of the applicable norms and practice of other states, and so forth, the rapporteurs would draft an opinion to be presented to the plenary of the Venice Commission for consideration, where then all of the members can comment on the draft and propose changes and contribute to its finalization. And those drafts then are usually adopted by a consensus vote, typically. It's rare, but it does happen sometimes that the disagreements are strong enough that a formal vote will be taken, and so that those who object to the opinion can register their dissidence. The process, importantly, is very quick and responsive. That's rare for international organizations. It's extremely rare for international human rights-oriented organizations, where many of the courts and committees and tribunals have many, many years of delay. In the case of the Venice Commission, an opinion is usually rendered in the space of months. Sometimes urgent opinions are issued that are rendered even in the space of a short number of weeks. So you can imagine the work is quite intense when it does come to us. It has evolved quite a bit over the years. Started historically, as I said, with a focus on Central and Eastern Europe and very basic questions about the design of constitutional systems, the creation of new electoral laws for democratic processes, and so forth. Over the years, interestingly, the Commission has had opportunities to turn its attention back to Western Europe to some extent, as it's gained sort of capital and credibility. Countries such, for example, in the recent sessions we finished last week, we had an extensive opinion examining a very, very complicated new set of laws regarding citizen security in Spain and its conformity with human rights standards. The recent crisis in the Netherlands over child support subsidies from the government that led to the fall of the government last fall in the Netherlands is going to be the subject of a Venice Commission opinion regarding the rule of law and the protection of the rule of law in Netherlands. But maybe even more interestingly, it has expanded over the years beyond Europe altogether. To Central Asia, countries such as Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, all the way to East Asia. Korea is an active member. In the wake of the Arab Spring, a number of Arab North African countries, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco became members and made requests for opinions. Israel became a member in, I believe, 2011. And now the Americas as well have joined the community of nations gathered at the Venice Commission. The United States, Mexico, Peru, Chile are all members. And I think the most recent member of all, after having observer status for a while, is Canada. So it has developed geographically, but also thematically. As you'll see in a moment, there have been recent tensions that become manifest between the Venice Commission and some of the states as certain constitutional and democratic crises have emerged over time in recent years in parts of Europe and Central Asia in particular, with the backsliding of the democratic gains that had been achieved in some of the early years after authoritarian rule. I'll come back to a couple examples of that in a moment. I just say before I do that probably the most common question I get when I speak about the Venice Commission, so I'll address it now before it comes up inevitably in the question and answer, is, well, what kind of an impact does it have? Are its opinions actually followed and complied with? As those who work on any issues of compliance at the international level know that's always a very complicated question. But I think it is safe to say that the Venice Commission, by any measure, has had an really remarkable influence and successes in helping to advance the basic goals for which it was established. In the 30 years of its existence, it's issued over 900 opinions, and those the requests for opinions continue to grow, in part, I think, in acknowledging sort of the role that has succeeded in playing. Is consulted widely and relied upon by member states, but also by actors within the international community. The United Nations, the European Union, national entities like the US Department of State are intensely interested in what's going on in the Venice Commission and use the opinions in crafting their foreign policy responses to particular nation situations. But beyond that, the sort of the nub of the question is: are the recommendations implemented at the national level to the actors to whom they're directed? Of course, and the answer again is yes. Typically, I mean, universally, to the extent that that question is asking whether the Commission's opinions are the object of media attention, inserted into political debates, used by stakeholders in political processes of the reform, and becomes part of the normative and discursive framework within which legislative and constitutional change happens. That doesn't necessarily mean that all of its recommendations are going to be complied with in a strict, narrow sense, of course. But that's in large part because there are many different factors in play. First of all, the recommendations themselves can be very narrow or very broad. Sometimes it's a very small technical fix to a particular law, and that might happen, as a matter of course. Other times it involves a recommendation to make major changes in an entire constitutional framework, and that, of course, is much harder to get implemented, especially in a comprehensive way. Sometimes the laws are already implemented. Sometimes they're in draft form or just proposals. It makes a difference who's requesting it. If the request is coming from political actors, especially those in the political majority, there tends to be a presumption that there's a lot more political interest and will in abiding by or following the Venice Commission's recommendations, and we're likely to see that. The history that a particular state has with the Venice Commission will make an enormous difference as well, as I'll describe shortly with respect to Ukraine. One other thing to mention, actually, never mind, I'll come back to it if I can in questions, otherwise I'm sure I'll run out of time. So let me just take a few minutes to sort of give you a couple more concrete examples in just a few minutes on the kind of engagement that the Venice Commission has had with specific country situations regarding constitutional crises over the years. One example is with Ukraine. The Venice Commission has played a leading role in Ukraine's transition from totalitarianism, beginning from the very early part of its constitutional transitions in 1995. And it has issued dozens of opinions in the period since then. After the adoption of its new constitution, it became actively involved in trying to help shape the process of further constitutional reform. And in particular, it's had a whole series of opinions focusing on the status of the procurator or prosecutor general, which is an institution that is a strong legacy of Soviet-era repression in many countries. Many opinions regarding the independence of the judiciary. In the course of rendering these opinions, the Commission found itself for a period of years almost in perpetual tension and even conflict with successive Ukrainian administrations, in particular during the hard pendulum swing towards authoritarianism in the government of Yanukovych. But after the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, that period over 25 years of cooperation and involvement of the Venice Commission on behalf of the Consolidation of Democracy sort of came to fruition in a certain sense, as the Ukrainian authorities started cooperating in a very active and sustained way with the Venice Commission, which resulted in the passage of comprehensive systemic judicial reform in 2016. So as one commentator put it, he says, the post-Revolution of Dignity reforms mark a colossal breakthrough in the institutionalization of the rule of law and European values in Ukraine. The opinions and recommendations of the Venice Commission facilitated Ukraine's integration, not just into the constitutional structures of the European Union, he says, but also promoted the integration of the concept of the rule of law into the Ukrainian legal thought and doctrine, and ultimately practice. So that cooperation has largely continued over questions like language laws, minority protections, the educational system. Now, that's not to say that there aren't ongoing difficulties. There's been a recent engagement in particular over the continued need for reform of the Constitutional Court. Those have been the two opinions that I've been involved in directly, which I'd be happy to talk about if there's time in question and answer. So, but I don't want to suggest that, having developed a cooperative relationship, there aren't ongoing tensions. Of course, there are, but it's a constructive relationship, certainly. And it contrasts a little bit with the second example I want to give you, which is the Venice Commission's engagement with Hungary over the last 10 years. As many of you will know, after its landslide victory in 2010 and the parliamentary elections, the Fidesz party gained a supermajority that was sufficient to engage in substantial constitutional amendments and eventually an entire rewriting of the fundamental law of Hungary. And the Venice Commission issued a large number of opinions over the following years during that succession of amendments, starting in 2011, really, including severe criticism of many elements of the new constitution. And the Hungarian government has, from that first set of opinions, largely rejected the criticism of the Venice Commission and engaged, at least periodically, in a strategy of accusing the Venice Commission of bad faith and of political bias. So the new fundamental law has gone on to be amended many times, 9, I believe, since its entry into force. And the Venice Commission is at the request typically of the political institutions of the Council of Europe, has continued to express concern about those, in particular about the 4th constitutional amendment, which many commentators regard as marking in an important way the end of the rule of law and constitutionalism in Hungary, given the way that it seriously compromised the independence of the Constitutional Court and the effectiveness of the Constitutional Court as an institution. So that hasn't stopped the Venice Commission from continuing to issue a steady stream of opinions, at least 20 of them since then. But it has generally not had great success in orienting the more problematic decisions and policies of the Orban government in any of these areas. Hungary does not usually openly reject in its entirety the Venice Commission opinions, and occasionally it has even requested opinions of its own, for example, on the reorganization of administrative courts in 2019. Often the government will make some marginal changes in a proposed law in response to the Venice Commission and thus declare cooperation at a certain level, but ignore some of the other and more fundamental ones. And more importantly, I think the Venice Commission is to a certain extent, increasingly finding itself caught between the political hostility of the regional European institutions to the Orban regime and the Hungarian resistance to that European influence. And the Venice Commission that has always relied on its sort of political neutrality as part of its calling card to sustain a claim of credibility and integrity is put in a difficult situation there. So let me sort of use the last few minutes just to make some observations of sort of lessons that I think we can draw from the general operation of the Venice Commission and what we're seeing in the specific cases like Ukraine, Hungary, and others about what's going on in the region. So first, with respect to sort of constitutionalism and the rule of law and democracy generally, I mean, it's not news to say that erosion and backsliding is prevalent in many places. That's well known. We've seen that and been reading about it for years. But it does become very much more apparent both that it's happening and the particular mechanisms by which it's happening when one looks comprehensively at the collection of Venice Commission opinions over different constitutional systems or over time in a particular constitutional system. And one of the things that we can see, which is a challenge for the Venice Commission itself, but also in general for political responses to that erosion, is that it can happen in very gradual and piecemeal ways. And so it makes it hard to respond in any one particular or decisive way to a break in a tradition in constitutionalism. So going back to Hungary, for example, many people have discussed the abusive nature of the use of constitutional amendments in Hungary over time, but it's not always evident when you take one single constitutional amendment at a time, which are considered sort of, reasonably functionally oriented towards a better working constitutional system, and which ones are more intended to undermine the core values of that system. And that's in part because it's the meaning and effect of any of these texts and reforms is not always determined just, and in fact rarely or never determined just by the text itself, but much more by the interplay among the normative text, the institutional practice, and the political narratives that the governing parties are constructing around them and how they're using them. The other thing that I think we can say in general about the patterns of backsliding or challenges or erosion is that pervasively the most frequent area of concern that I've seen in my 2 years of reading and debating these opinions is efforts aimed specifically at compromising the independence of the judiciary. Both the ordinary judiciary and in particular, any body that has the power of constitutional adjudication. Executive power is also a great concern, and those two are often united. In other words, the growth and expense of executive power often comes at the expense, or is designed to come at the expense of the independence of the judiciary. And by seeing those as the most frequent and in certain sense threatening constitutional developments, I think one of the lessons that can be drawn to, again, not something new, but something that's important to be confirmed in practice and to be reminded of. And I say this in particular as a scholar and practitioner of human rights law, is that in many cases, the protection of human rights and liberties and human dignity is more affected by the structural constitutional questions regarding things like separation of powers, judicial independence, executive control, than by the rights provisions of the constitutions themselves. I think that's an important lesson for human rights policy in general. And it's one that in some senses, echoes the insights that the earliest practitioners of constitutional design, such as Madison and Hamilton and those in the United States and in other countries, realized that the structural protections of human liberty and human dignity are in many ways the guarantees of the individual rights that then are also coupled with the Constitution. A third and final sort of observation I would make is that it's extraordinary how much, in how many countries and how deeply the legacy and the scars of communist rule are still pervasive and are still damaging to the institutions. The notions of separation of powers, the role of the judiciary, this institution of the Procuratura that I mentioned earlier, all of those are deeply affected by Soviet socialist attitudes and theories, deeply ingrained in the 20th century about law. The idea of the rule of law in that tradition is that it's ruled by law. It's not rule of law as a way to control power, but a rule of law and by law exactly as a way to exercise and consolidate power. So there really is no separation of powers in that theory. There is a unity of power and then an allocation of the unity of power in order to effect control. The judiciary becomes a form of civil service and the Procuratura becomes an all-encompassing way of exercising supervision, even over what otherwise would be, in theory, independent branches or actors within the constitutional system. And one very stark example of that I saw was just over the last few weeks in drafting an opinion on the new constitution of Kyrgyzstan, which in many ways is not only a return to a presidential model, but a return to a super presidential model with very, very strong echoes of the Soviet system. The last thing I'll say in terms of lessons, turning now from what's going on in the countries with respect to the rule of law and constitutionalism and back to the Venice Commission as such, is that it's worth reflecting, I think, on what has made the Venice Commission relatively successful as an international institution capable of addressing some of those issues and contributing constructively to the consolidation of democracy. One thing is obviously, clearly, it's expertise, as I mentioned at the beginning. I mean, assembled around the room is a pretty extraordinary collection of people who take their work very seriously and with great integrity and high degrees of professionalism, bringing many, many cumulative years of study and experience to the question. A second area is the Venice Commission's insistence on its neutrality and impartiality. The idea there is that politically it doesn't take sides in disputed questions, and that its work is technical. That's why it's democracy through law. It's the appeal to legality and to the objective status of legal rules is an important part of what gives the Commission a certain kind of gravitas that is widely recognized, even sometimes recognized by those who resist it. These are points I'm all going to come back to because there's always a but to them, right? But that idea more generally of being through law is a very important part of the role that it plays. But to say that is not to say that it isn't also, in important ways, a political actor and engaged with other political actors and institutions, and that is also essential to its work. If it were just a technical body issuing opinions off in some room or some library, then I don't think anybody would really read them, let alone take them seriously. But rather the fact that it's very actively engaged with international as well as internal political actors, opposition parties as well as majorities, civil society, the EU, the Council of Europe, it partners with the OSCE often, makes it all much more likely that the opinions are going to have a certain kind of political resonance, where even if ultimately they may not be implemented in their details, they will almost always have a certain kind of impact in shifting the terms of discourse, the areas of political pressure, and so forth. And the last thing I'll note in terms of its where it sort of gains some of its effectiveness and credibility is, which is maybe of particular kind of interest to here to the Nanovic Institute, is that it implicitly trades quite a bit on the idea of the value and the strength of European standards, of a common European constitutional framework and values, of a common European history, and all that sort of symbolically carries with it in terms of stability, prosperity, the protection of individual rights, and the rule of law. Now, I also note, here comes the but, that all of those things that help to make the Venice Commission effective in its work and influential also to some extent have certain caveats associated with them that also provide challenges to being effective in the work. So the other side of the same coin, so to speak. It has a high degree of expertise, but at the same time, in some senses, expert international bodies can sometimes be lost in a celebration or a valuing of an expert model of engagement that may not always be the most effective or the most sort of recognized. In other words, one of the ways in which it's quite European is that there's a very high degree of trust in expert bodies and in bureaucracies. And sometimes that doesn't necessarily prove to be effective. Similarly, the question of neutrality and political engagement can also be a liability. Neutrality can be detachment and therefore a lack of influence if you're trying too hard to be neutral. And political engagement can be a liability insofar as it opens the Venice Commission up to the charges, for example, like I mentioned, by Hungary, that it is politically biased or engaged in a partisan effort when under the cover of technical or neutral norms and standards. And finally, even the Europeanness of it is, I wouldn't say a liability ever, but can be sometimes a constraint. European models of constitutional structure and reform have certain dimensions of them that are not necessarily shared by all parts of the world. And I feel this acutely coming from someone immersed in the US constitutional tradition, that sometimes things are slightly sort of at odds, and the center of gravity being so strongly of a European identity, sometimes that's not always realized. Fortunately, the diversity of legal systems represented around the room is, serves as an important check on that in most circumstances. And finally, the last point I'll make about the challenges is the fact that it tries to operate through law from its very title and from its very origin. Legal solutions are powerful in part because they're able to abstract from the specific facts of specific circumstances and provide more generalized and consistent kinds of standards. That's part of what gives the rule of law its importance in helping to direct and coordinate human behavior for the common good in a constitutional system. But that sort of abstraction, to some extent, that law almost necessarily sort of pulls towards, can sometimes make it difficult to engage in the extremely context-specific kinds of judgments that need to be made in many of these individual circumstances. So appealing to a broad standard of law, doesn't mean that one can just transplant it into a new environment and expect that the beneficial outcomes in favor of democracy and the rule of law will therefore follow. One has to judge the soil, the light, the climate before making those transplants, and that's difficult to do. Especially because none of us are experts in all of the countries that we're called to render judgments about. So anyway, I'll stop there in the interest of time. I've already gone over the declared 30 minutes I would do, but I'll just conclude by saying I encourage you to follow more what the Venice Commission is doing. If you have any interest in the mechanisms by which human rights and democracy and the rule of law are advanced in the world, it's a fascinating, rich, important, and influential body. And speaking in a university context here, I'll also say I find it surprisingly and vastly understudied, given how much interesting data there is there to draw on. So I'm happy to take questions about any of that and anything else. Back to you, Clemens.
Thank you so much, Paolo. First and foremost, thank you so much. That was eye-opening. So much we didn't know and we should know. So we feel a little bit ashamed now, I think. Dear audience, floor is open. Please make use of the Q&A button. I have a number of questions. We received one so far, which is about the publication. Are there requests of and recommendations from the Commission, probably also the opinions, made public, or is it perhaps at the discretion of the country?
No, it's all very public and transparent. So often, prior to a formal request being made, there can be extended periods of private negotiations going on and dialogues. In particular, where the Venice Commission is trying to encourage the member state itself to make a request rather than the Council of Europe institutions, right? We would always prefer that the requests come from inside the state itself. And so they're often, very discreet and private negotiations and discussions going on in that phase. But once the request is made, everything is always very public. The request itself, the terms of it, and then the opinion when it's rendered.
Thank you, Paolo. Some practical questions. What is the working language? Are advisory opinions translated officially?
The working languages are English and French, and they're always available. All the documents are available in both English and French. We very frequently, although it's not officially a working language, we'll very frequently have simultaneous translation available to and from Russian. And the opinions are always subsequently translated also into the language of the particular state to whom it's addressed.
Got it. But your amazing Italian is useful in the hallways and when you were in Venice, right?
It is in Venice. So it's not quite like being at the Vatican in terms of Italian being a lingua franca, but there is a certain sort of similarity there where Italian is always sort of in the background, not least because the president of the Venice Commission for the last 20 years, as well as the founding president of the Venice Commission, are both Italian. So.
Thank you so much for representing Notre Dame. Annibal had this question. First of all, great talk. What are the sources of law that the Venice Commission can consider when addressing questions? Besides the idea of a jus commune, are there any limitations, any hierarchy of sources?
Yeah, so it's a really important question because exactly the sources that the Venice Commission draws on are closely related to the kinds of recommendations that it makes, because there is a clear hierarchy. Being an institution that it is intended and designed to be founded on law, all of the directly applicable treaties regarding the countries in question are the first and most important source. So where there is hard international law standards that we can point to, we'll use those. And accordingly, the recommendations then tend to have a much stronger kind of language. The country must take these measures to be in compliance with its international obligations. But the Commission, importantly, doesn't stop there. So it will go on to take, what are sometimes called soft law sources. I don't really like that term because it's not law, but they're recommendations. But they're recommendations that have a certain kind of official status to them, and we will use those also to make certain kinds of judgments. But then typically the recommendations are also calibrated accordingly and couched in language like "we believe it would be preferable to," or "we recommend taking this into account," or something. And then finally, not in a source of law in any direct sense, but important foundation is comparative practice. So very many of the recommendations of the Venice Commission are merely based in an analysis of saying, look, we've examined the constitutional practice in a variety of other systems, sometimes systems with parallel concerns, or practices or histories in order to provide more comparability. And based on that experience, here's what we would recommend be eliminated from this constitutional draft or added to it or so forth. And again, the language that's used sort of corresponds to the bindingness or not of the sources that we're drawing on.
Thank you, Paolo. There's an anonymous question. Has the Commission ever addressed any requests regarding the United States?
No, there's never been a request made regarding the United States. The United States has been a member for about, I would estimate about 8 or 10 years now. It was just an observer state before then, but nobody's requested one.
Great. We just received a question from Europe. Let's take this first. From Samuel Machut. Greetings from Slovakia. Has the Commission discussed the problem of banning some activities during the coronavirus pandemic, especially the banning of masses and church services in general?
Yes, thank you for the question. So one of the things I didn't mention along the way for lack of time, so I'll take advantage of this question to mention it, is that in addition to the country-specific opinions regarding the questions addressed to it on reforms, the Venice Commission can and does undertake thematic studies on particular questions of its own accord. It might be trying to devise general standards regarding the protection of freedom of peaceful assembly, or it might be gathering comparative experience and making recommendations in the abstract regarding the financing of political parties, etc. And so although the Venice Commission has not been asked to render an opinion yet, at least, on a specific legal reform regarding the pandemic and associated measures taken by the governments, it was one of the very first bodies anywhere in the world very soon into the pandemic lockdowns in last spring to poll all of its members to draw the information from us, each individually. So I reported on what was going on in the United States and used all of that information to issue a report on emergency measures in which it made some clear recommendations about what is consistent and not with international standards. So you can find that. The report is already almost a year old at this point.
How fascinating. We have so many questions, Paolo. I already apologize. We may not be able to accommodate all of them. When the Commission renders an opinion that generates disagreement from the respective country, what are the methods of negotiations, if applicable, to reach a consensus decision?
To reach a
consensus decision.
A consensus decision within the Commission? Is that the question, or between the Commission and
with the country? If there's disagreement from the respective country, what are the methods of negotiations?
Yeah, well, so we do in the process of writing and debating the decision, share an initial draft with a member state. So we obviously meet with them first, ask for all of their input, share a draft with them, and solicit their input on the draft, and very frequently we'll make changes based on that input, where we've misunderstood something or judged something wrong. We'll acknowledge that. And then afterwards, there's often a period of follow-up where we'll continue to engage in dialogue with members of the states. They'll be invited to the plenary sessions to speak about what they're doing and so forth. I think one of the most important tools, frankly, and sometimes to its detriment, but I think mostly in a positive sense, is the Commission's awareness that the importance of its role demands that it not overplay its hand. Right. In other words, it is the temptation of human rights bodies everywhere, in my estimation, that there's sometimes an inverse correlation between the impact that they have and the sense of freedom that they have from anything that the governments are going to do and expect. Right. So to be blunt about it, if no one's going to take you seriously, then you're much more free in what you're going to say, right? And I'd say the Commission, both the Secretariat and the Commissioners, are acutely conscious of that fact. Again, sometimes perhaps regrettably, but mostly in a positive way, they're careful to try to be realistic in calibrating what their recommendations are as something that's realistic. Now, I will say it doesn't stop us from in hard cases where the rule of law is being seriously compromised or threatened to be compromised from saying so. But on many of the reforms, there's a real give and take.
Thank you. A question from our Nanovic fellow, Vittorio Hösle, who gave us a great lecture a few weeks ago. Thanks, Paolo, for a splendid exposition. An issue I would like to hear more about is the constitutional development of Poland from the fall of 2015 on in the eyes of the Venice Commission. Yes,
well, as you may surmise, there's been quite a serious and ongoing set of conflicts between the Polish regime and the Venice Commission. In particular, the Venice Commission's series of opinions on reform of the judiciary. It fits exactly into sort of the stream in that area that I was referring to earlier. And it's been, I would say, one of the least constructive relationships that I've witnessed in the 2 years that I've been there, but even going back before that, clearly. I will say that this is also an example. I don't want to. I'm going to be very careful in saying this. The Venice Commission has said very clearly in a number of opinions. One of them I was a rapporteur for, that the various ways in which, in particular, the executive branch was seeking to exercise much more direct forms of control over the judiciary is highly problematic for the rule of law. And I don't disagree with that at all. That's I think quite clear and evident. But in rendering those opinions, it also is true that it's an example of what I was saying earlier about the importance and difficulty also of trying to take context into account.
Yeah.
Right. In Poland, there never was a serious reform of the judiciary post-communism. And that's part of the legacy that the government is trying to deal with here. Now, that doesn't mean that they're then authorized to do anything, notwithstanding the principles of the rule of law to deal with it.
Yeah.
But I think it is important to try to read that context as well. And it's hard to say where that's going to go. There's not been much dialogue with Poland over these questions, unfortunately. And the Venice Commission's influence has largely been with respect to the European institutions. And in their formulating their policies with respect to Poland.
And that's where the political hostility comes in that you mentioned before, European institutions vis-a-vis Poland. Yeah, got it.
Precisely. Yeah.
Again, apologies to our audience for the questions we will not be able to answer. Maybe a last one. Thanks for a superb talk. Following on from what has just been said, how are distinct legal practices, legal cultures, and legal traditions taken into account when advising on particular models, e.g. with reference to judicial appointment procedures which differ from state to state?
Yes, that's a really important factor. And I think that, in fact, if I had to just emphasize, the top 3 or top 5 reasons why the Venice Commission is capable of rendering sort of serious, worthwhile recommendations and work, it's because of the strength of its comparative practices. How those enter into the play comes in part because of the long experience and of the Secretariat and its professional lawyers there who do a lot of comparative work and who themselves represent a wide array of legal systems from all different parts of Europe. But then, of course, even more importantly, at the second level, by the rapporteurs that are selected. So, we'll bring to the table the perspectives that are deeply informed by our own constitutional traditions. That's part of the reason why it's so important that there is this now global diversity at the heart of European constitutionalism on these questions. Is that there's probably the most frequent form of debate, dialogue, and exchange between us is exactly the one that says, in my constitutional system or in the constitutional systems that I'm more familiar with, this is how we do it. And that doesn't accord with what you're saying, how it's done in your country. So let's not make a recommendation just on the basis of your country's practices, but let's try to arrive at more general conclusions about what the appropriate, prudential judgments are about how to instantiate the rule of law.
Beautiful. Collegiality and prudence. Don't we need this all? Paolo, thank you so much. We are at time. Respecting your busy schedules, we just wanted to thank Paolo once again for a very stimulating lecture and amazing Q&A session. Again, thank you, dear audience, for being with us, asking your questions, and apologies that we couldn't attend to them all. This has been a virtual event, so we owe a lot of gratitude to our tech and communications team to make this possible. Grant, Osborne, Mel Webb, Jen Lektansky, and our new colleague, Grania McEvoy. Thank you so much. At the very end, let me please remind you that the Nanovic Institute will host another virtual lecture next week, March 30th at 12:45. Our Nanovic graduate fellow, Claire O'Hare, will also talk about something connected to the legal sphere. She will talk about the Irish judges at the center of the English Commercial Court. Stay tuned. Many thanks, Paolo, again. Thank you all. Have a good afternoon and goodbye. Thank you now.
My pleasure. Paolo. Thank you for hosting me, Clemens.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks.